Good morning, everyone. Well done for being here on this very dark, snowy Friday morning in Eindhoven. It's wonderful to see you. I was saying to Annie, we should not be so surprised when. Yeah, very excited to begin and introduce today's sessions, but also perhaps myself and Susan and Sophie to give a broader introduction to the conference as a whole. And for those of you who weren't here yesterday, maybe to just reiterate from my perspective, or the Van Abbe's perspective, why we're excited by this collaboration, why we're doing this collaboration. I think the Van Abbe for some time has been interested in complicating our relationship to modernism, our understanding of modernism. I think one of the strongest things I'll take away from Iris's wonderful talk last night was this idea of not a question of accommodating more practices, but how we reorganize certain maps. And I think this collaboration with black artists and modernism, and as Charles was talking about yesterday, thinking about how we can take certain things from certain practices within the UK and look at them in relationship to Europe, and look at those practices also in relation to other geographies and other contexts, yesterday South America, but there'll be many more today, is one of the ways that we can start to reorganize certain maps. What I want to do very briefly is just to say a huge thank you to my co-conveners, Sophie Orlando and Susan Pu San Lok. They came to me and to the Van Abbe over a year ago with the suggestion for this conference, which, as they'll explain, is part of their 3-year work on black artists and modernism. And whilst I was delighted to partake in this conference and these discussions, this idea really germinated with them, and it has been their baby in terms of thinking it through. So huge thank you for coming to us, coming to the Van Abbe to enable and realize this collaboration, and for your extraordinary work in conceptualizing it and putting it together. So with that, I'll say a little bit more about the structure of the next couple of days at the end, but with that, I'll hand over to Susan.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Nick. We should, in fact, thank all the Van Abbe staff, but especially Nick, who we've worked with closely over the last year. It's been a delight exploring the possibilities of what this conference might look like, and really trying to figure out where it could go. We'd also like to thank Annie Fletcher and Jantin Klaus for all their support over the last year, and Charles also for his warm welcome last night, Iris for the wonderful keynote, as Nick said, and of course the discussions and rich conversations that followed from there. We'd like to thank our colleagues in the Black Artists and Modernism project, Sonia Boyce and David DeBosa, who are both here, also Naomi Bulliard, Ellie Cameron Smith, Hamad Nassar also here, and then there are those who can't be here, Anjali Dalal Clayton, who is in fact the only full-time member of the BAM team, busy literally juggling babies at the moment. We also want to thank past BAM contributors unable to join us today, this weekend, Marlene Smith, Paul Goodwin, Ella Spencer-Mills and Pamela Crawford. We should thank also UAL, University of Arts London, Middlesex University and the HRC for making this event possible. So to give you the briefest of introductions to the Black Artists and Modernism project, or BAM for short, there'll be many questions arising, I'm sure, which hopefully we'll be able to pursue over the breaks or through the discussions, plenaries, etc. So BAM is a 3-year project funded by the HRC, and it's now in its final year. It's led by Sonia Boyce, who's the principal investigator, and myself and David DeBosa as co-investigators. The project seeks to address the art historical amnesia and aporia around artists of African, Asian and Caribbean descent or heritage in Britain. Our key questions are premised on the tendency for discussions of biography, ethnicity and identity politics to supersede, if not eclipse, the significance of the artworks themselves. As art objects that speak to and impact on developments and narratives of art throughout the last century. As such, BAM sets out to investigate the often understated connections as well as points of conflict between Black British artists' practices and their relationships to modernism. After Stuart Hall, we understand modernism as an unfinished project that is extended into postmodernism, and within this we seek to acknowledge the conjuncture of generations of Black British artists that have been both for and against modernist dictates. We should add that we also share Cobina Mercer's view that, quote, modernity was never a unitary or homogeneous phenomenon, but was always differentiated by the local conditions on which cross-cultural encounters were lived. I think we can probably swap the term modernity for conceptualism here also. I should briefly qualify the BAM team's understanding and uses of the term Black. Please note that, note the plurality. We are not aligned around a single or fixed definition, but rather are sympathetic to a range of positions in relation to both Black art and Black artists. Note too that the project is called Black Artists and Modernism, not Black Art and. The distinction is important, but not unproblematic, and both remain, of course, contested spaces. Broadly, the BAM team uses the term Black art to refer to largely UK-based practices driven by criticality and critique, be that in relation to racially conditioned cultural and political hegemony, Western philosophies of modernity, or Western imperialism and related processes of othering. Ultimately, we understand Black art as productive of political and critical agency. Meanwhile, some of us have sometimes deployed Black artist as a critical affiliation or assertion of political affinity, rather than as an ethnic or demographic alignment. At the same time, however, multicultural managerialism, as Sarat Maharaj puts it, continues to produce administrative and bureaucratic definitions of Black that default to ethnicity and or geography. We realise that BAM's conceptual premise is not without paradoxes. We use the category of Black artists to help us to identify certain works in UK national public collections, yet we also seek to challenge the very basis of such differentiation in order to attend to the work itself. We acknowledge the local, historical, geographic and cultural specificity of these terms, their arguable untranslatability, and posit the already international impact of certain artists and practices present in collections, yet absent or marginalised within dominant cultural and art historical narratives. We draw on the emerging findings of our audit of works in national collections to pursue entwined threads, strands of research, monographic and museological, in order to explore the following questions. How do we come to know or forget this work? What connections, contentions and constellations begin to emerge when we foreground the artwork over the artist and prioritise, as Jean Fisher put it, the work between us? I'll hand over now to Sophie Orlando, who will say something about the conceptual premise of the conference.
It's going to be hard. So thank you very much. I have to say, it was a great pleasure to work with Suzanne and Nick during the last year. It was so interesting, so I wanted to share that with you. So welcome everybody, thank you for being here today. So as you just listened, so why the BAM project is about Black artists in the British context. My role as a researcher in the project has been to develop a study trying to develop questions about the BAM questions in the European context. So we started with the idea that art criticism served the artworks of black British artists inadequately. So despite a recent normalization of diversity and discussion on cultural difference within the art world, a critical art historical amnesia remains prominent. I'm quoting here a part of the BAM project. So the question became how to write about, but also exhibit and collect conceptual art practices using politics or race, class, gender, sexuality as their material, not as an identity question. And so in the European context, most of us here are able to situate field studies that we may refer to or to use, such as Black studies, migrational studies, new art history, but why does it seem so complicated to associate conceptual art practice in terms of race, class, gender, besides the usual suspects such as Mary Kelly, an American artist that came to Britain, or Adrian Piper, another American artist based in Berlin? So the first answer could be, well, there's no any conceptual artworks dealing with this kind of topic in Europe, which is quite bizarre. We could say also, well, those terms are inappropriate. So what about Lee Renshaw? What about Rashida Rein? What about David Medalla or Mona Atoom, which are really barely associated with the term conceptual art or conceptualism? So it's how the frame of this project began. I mean, if the term black artist is not, doesn't work really as a coherent historical category in other parts of Europe, we cannot erase the fact of institutional racism. Also, we cannot avoid the fact that we cannot forget the fact that there is an inadequacy of our tools of interpretation based on a very hegemonic or ideological art history. So starting from here, we decided to discuss conceptualism and intersectionality as a framework of this thinking. So besides decades of rewriting, reframing the term conceptual art, whatever it is from Alexander Albero, Lux Skrybowski, or Boris Groys, and some others, conceptualism is a term broadly discussed as a tool contesting the hegemony of Euro-US artistic canon. And Iris was quoting some people that have been working on this field, such as Anna Longoni, or Marchand Fils, or Wiz Kanitzer, of course, that we've been talking yesterday. Also, in a recent book, Professor Neisencheck defines conceptualism as a mode of practice that acknowledges the first generation of conceptual art, which its turn to overt representation of political matter under the influence of the civil rights, Black Power, students' movement, second wave of feminism, gay liberation movements, etc. So we started this project with this definition. Now, intersectionality. We usually situate intersectionality as a very open term commonly used by feminist activists, such as the Combari Rivers Collective in 1977, or as a term used in social sciences. Also, we acknowledge the intersection of race, class, gender, and sexuality as a common tool used to discuss and contest universalism. Now, in the field of art, the intersection of struggles against racism, sexism, and the history of class hegemony, the acknowledgement of difference amongst women in terms of power relationship, were also debated for decades by feminist art historians. And so in that context of the field of art, intersectionality is a great field of epistemological investigation. So it's in this understanding of epistemological investigation that we use the term intersectionality. So basically, intersectionality is a method of reading the artistic gestures. So in order to build this symposium, I have developed within BAM a series of seminars around those steps in European collections, involving artists associated with conceptualism or artists affiliated or situated in the inheritance with conceptualism. So the aim was to bring people from different discipline backgrounds to discuss the work from within a public collection. The first seminar was developed at the Frac Lorraine in France with Michaela Assolant, and we welcomed the commission paper of the art historian Fabienne Dumont on Nilialter. The second seminar was developed at the State Museum with the help of the curator Bart Rutten, and we commissioned a paper by Charles Landrecht on Stanley Brown's practice. The third seminar was developed at the vanabbemuseum with Stephanie Hero, head of the research, and curator Frank Lamy, and Lodge Arts, which was commissioned to present a paper on Mathieu Aboninck. Now, a study day was also organized with Sonia Boyce and myself at the INIVA to discuss the work of David Medalla, and we welcomed the paper of Eva Bencheva, amongst other fascinating papers. So I would like to thank, of course, all the contributors of these seminars. It was really rich, and I know that I'm forgetting a lot of people, that, for instance, Sandra Delacour, which is going to present today as well. Not tomorrow, actually. So that's a good way to set the place to Nick, which is going to explain the program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. As Charles mentioned yesterday, the kind of beginnings of this discussion happened in an exhibition that I was involved in at the Vanabbe in 2016, called The 1980s Today's Beginnings, where we looked at a number of different European contexts, and one of those was focusing on what's come to be termed the UK Black Arts Movement. And I think it's very important that those initial discussions A, happened within the context of an exhibition, and B, happened within the context of an exhibition was looking at not only different European contexts alongside one another, but in a way also different counter-histories in a way to what we might expect from something looking at the 1980s. So the importance of both the exhibition frame and as a way, as Iris has said, as a kind of reorganizing of maps, I think was kind of fundamental to the genesis of this project. And in that sense, it's no coincidence that the two keynotes that we have here are both curators. So as you heard from Iris Dressler last night, the first of the keynotes, Subversive Practices, Art Under Conditions of Political Repressions. And tomorrow we'll hear from Valerie Castle-Oliver, Double Consciousness, Black Conceptual Art since 1970. How the rest of the panels will be structured will be a series of papers, and then after those papers we will have discussions. We'll begin with the panel chaired by Annie Fletcher in a moment, and we will also have specific panels given over to artists' practices. As Sophie said, the kind of close reading of works within these various collections has been a kind of fundamental methodology of the project so far, and that's reflected in the format of the conference, where we try and really go in and look at the artists, look at the works themselves. Tomorrow we'll also have breakout sessions where we'll go and look at specific works, either in Rashid's show or in the collection display. So really to try and bring the discussion, or always to maintain the discussion around the works. So with that, I think we've talked enough. There's a lot more talking to happen. So again, a huge thank you to my co-conveners. Huge thank you for all of you for being here. And I pass over to my dear colleague, Annie Fletcher.